Australia, Siberia, and many other parts in between. And Ron says, I've wandered the wilderness for over 60 years and formulated my view of the importance of the environment. Thanks, Ron. You inspire me.
So am I to go next, or are you going to introduce the other guy?
No, just in a minute. Okay. And then Reverend Roxanne Friday. Are you on, Roxanne?
I'm here. Yes, I am.
Oh, you look beautiful. Wow.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really glad you could make it tonight. Yeah. So this is the short introduction for our spiritual leader from the Wind River Reservation, who knows her people and the work of your heart. Roxanne said, I come from the environment. That's the way I grew up. And culturally, we were always taught to care for the land. The last panelist in this order is Dr. Steve Williams, nationally known soil scientist. And he said, my experience in wildlands have influenced me more than anything else. Beginning at age 12, as I climbed a 12,000 foot peak, I was amazed at the panorama of it all. I want to live in such environments. Well, let's welcome the panelists as they speak on from their own incredibly rich experience about keeping the earth. Now, Ron, you're first.
Oh, okay, now the time. Okay, so I'm going to talk on science, materialism, and spirituality, because that is really the basis of the problem that we're dealing with. We're living in the age of science, and it actually is a pretty exciting time to be alive. Science has made things so that we can travel anywhere in the world, not quite instantaneously. It still takes me 24 hours to fly to Australia, but would have taken weeks 100 years ago on a ship. And it really has affected the way we communicate. I mean, I remember when I started in this game, doing a research project with a scientist in Amsterdam, and I'd type out a paper. I think I may have had a printer at the time, but I might print out a paper. I'd mail it to him. He'd make his corrections and mail it back to me. It would take 2 weeks. And now, of course, we can communicate on Zoom all over the world. So even in my short lifetime, I've seen huge changes in our ability to communicate. And science has done huge, incredible medical procedures that keep us alive. If I'd been living a century ago, I'd either be dead or be blind by now. Because about 10 years ago, I had my cataracts taken out. It was not too nasty a task. Just took a couple of days. But a couple of days after the surgery, maybe a week or so, it looked like they came back in one of the eyes. It was getting very fuzzy. And I went to the eye doctor, and he said, oh, yeah, the membrane's getting a little irritated. So he said, we'll just take the laser and blast it. So I went, laser like that, and it was suddenly my vision was great. And I said, well, what did you do before you had the laser? He said, well, we just used a bent pin. So with that, I was really glad that I lived in this world at this time, because I'd rather have a laser take care of my eye than a bent pin. So we're living in amazing times, but there's an incredible downside to amazing times that sometimes we're just not even aware of, or we don't even look at, because our society has huge drawbacks. Well, one of the problems is that our society values most highly things. In other words, one of the major goals of our society is to maintain an economy that makes more things. And that is one of the things that drives the attentions of our politicians. Those poor people who don't have an ability to attain these things have little value in the society, which explains why diseases of despair, suicide, alcoholism, and drug abuse is so prevalent in our society. The worldview that only things matter is called materialism, which believes that only things that are the only things that exist are those that you can see or measure. It has no spiritual aspects to it at all. Some people would argue that materialistic view is a direct outcome of the science that dominates our society today. Lost my notes here. An example of this materialistic view of reality comes from this Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the double helix of DNA. So most people would say this guy's really smart and knows everything. And he wrote a book in 1994 called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And his astonishing hypothesis is that you and your soul is nothing but chemical reactions in your brain. I mean, that's the classic example of a materialistic view of how not only society operates, but animals and human beings operate. Just simply chemical reactions in the brain. In terms of metaphysics, the argument that science is constructed upon materialistic view of reality is wrong. Science is dependent on the theory of naturalism, which is the view that the natural world is a product of processes that can be understood by rational study. Since science can only study the physical world, it can say nothing about the spiritual dimension. Thus, the contention that materialism is supported by this finding of science is completely wrong. Unfortunately, it is one of the major strengths that's holding up our worldview in our society today. The major effect of this economic growth inherent in materialism is the fact that the natural world, animals, plants, and the communities they inhabit have no value. Or at least their value is minimal compared to the resources that they might be obstructing. And this has led to extensive environmental degradation that became obvious about the middle of the last century. I would put the beginning of the environmental movement at the publication of the book by Rachel Carson called The Silent Spring in 1962. And not too long afterwards was the first Earth Day in 1970. So we're looking at an environmental movement that's 50 years old or older and is trying to save us from essentially the degradation that's driven by a materialistic economy. I can say the environmental movement is important for three reasons. First off, and most importantly, it is rallying activism against environmental degradation and climate change, engendered by the concept that the Earth is capable of supporting unlimited economic growth. That, of course, is important to all of us because although some of us may be old enough not to see the horrible realities that will occur from it, we're all being affected by climate change today. Secondly, the environmental movement is attacking the facade of materialism by emphasizing that there are important spiritual properties in the natural world that our economy doesn't recognize. The lives of individual animals and species have value. Natural interaction among animals and plants within the environment has value. Clean water and clean air have value. In many situations, these values trump the value of the economic growth that is associated with them. I don't know if any of you realized it or heard it. You probably heard it, but you probably didn't establish itself in his mind. But yesterday, they reported a vote in Greenland where the Greenland natives, or there's both natives and people descended from Danes there, but in their election, they changed the parties that ruled Greenland, and the party that's taken over was campaigning against the development of a giant mine in Greenland, where clearly the environment around it was much more valuable, they thought, than the $80 billion of rare earths that were located in the mine. And the third development in environmental science is solid evidence that science does not engender materialism. Environmental science is built upon the framework that a healthy environment is important to us and has an inherent value. Because this view is built upon concepts that are non-physical, this, by definition, is a spiritual value. This view that science is entirely materialistic is derived from a science that involves only physics and chemistry, which can be reduced to the studies of let's get, my notes are all over. Next time I'm going to print the notes out. Excuse me. So physics and chemistry can be reduced to the studies of how objects interact. For example, if you wanted to calculate the path the two billiard balls would follow, given the velocity and directions of movement of these balls, you don't need anything spiritual about them. If you wanted to calculate what happens, what chemical reaction would happen, you put a bunch of chemicals in a beaker and heated it up, you don't need anything related to spiritual values. However, if you want to do environmental work, it's based upon spiritual values, and these values are essentially inherent in the science. And that means, as I said right from the very beginning, science does not engender materialism, because we have aspects of science that have a very strong spiritual basis. And that's my introduction. Sloppy as it was.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. And thank you for trying throughout your integrity to bridge between science and spirituality. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce our next guest, who's like, it's such a privilege to have you here, Roxanne. You know, my sense is that your life is deeply a spiritual life. You're deeply connected to the earth, and it is a gift to us to be able to hear you. So I won't say anything more so you can speak. Thanks, Reverend Roxanne Friday.
Thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. If some of you don't know who I am, my name is Reverend Roxanne Friday, and I live in Fort Washakie, Wyoming. I'm an enrolled member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe and a descendant of the Seneca Nation of Indians in New York. I've been married for 36 years, and I have 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. I'm honored to be on this panel with these doctors of science. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. I'd like to start by saying that the word earth keeping is a powerful message in itself. The idea of keeping our earth, our planet, in good, healthy condition, with balance with nature and with human nature, is starting to reveal itself as not so healthy today. Let's talk about the way things happened before the COVID-19 pandemic and how we anticipated the meltdown of supply and demand. We saw the empty shelves in supermarkets in our neighborhoods, and we said to ourselves, what can we do to help in this situation? Then the thought of growing our own vegetables became a focus for the church, because in the past, we had grandparents who gardened and shared their crops with the rest of the community. I can speak for that for my husband's grandfather, who was, he was a big part of the church. And Sunday mornings, he would come down and share his crops with the rest of the community. Something that we're very proud of. And my own grandparents who gardened down by the creek where the water was flowing and the grass and the soil was very good to grow watermelons and that kind of stuff, just being a part of that to talk about with you all. And I know that every one of you out there had something to do also with gardens in their lives. And so the focus that I think that we need to look at is, we all kind of thought that grocery stores would always be fruitful and producing and being able to not worry about having to garden, right? Until we saw the shelves go empty. And we find that we were wrong in that thought process. We're noticing the change in climate. We're noticing that water is very important in our lives now. Water was always been a use in our traditional ceremonies in every aspect. We use water to survive, to pray with, to bathe in, to drink, to survive. We are noticing that the change in our climate affects how we are to garden. In Wyoming, we have a few months to get it done. If I was back in New York, where I grew up, we would have a longer season. So what do we plant in Wyoming gardening seasons? There are a lot of threats in food systems in the future, and keeping people motivated to grow their own produce is going to be an issue. To be self-sustaining and to harvest a crop, a good crop of food in winter, and to teach our younger generations to be focused on that same issue. I mean, it starts with education and knowledge of the climate, the changes that are going on. This is real. These changes are happening. And the society that we live in needs to be able to address these issues within their own communities. And I find that the church is involved by keeping people motivated in their purpose. Because we do have overcrowding in homes here on the reservation. And that poses a threat to our food systems. We need more education on sustaining ourselves. Otherwise, we may go as far as starvation. These are real issues. So what we need to do is build partnerships with outside communities to help us bring together the same minds in communities divided. And when I say communities divided, I mean that there is a lot of animosity in our tribes, our fellow tribal members here on the reservation. And it's because they're not enrolled. Some of them are not enrolled. And this is the things we're facing today. That should not matter. It shouldn't matter if you're enrolled or not, to be a part of a program that helps us to be self-sustainable. On the other hand, because we've been through so much trauma in our lives, we tend to forgive easily. We do. And we still help each other through those tough times. I saw people get involved when no one else would. I'd like to give notice to a friend of mine. Her name is Dara, Good Voice Elk. Some of you might know her. And I spoke with her. I talked with her. And we're going to probably build a really good relationship out of this whole thing because she is passionate about creating gardens within the communities. And what we talked about was the psychological issues that come with gardening or even touching Mother Earth, putting your hands in the dirt. It brought back feelings of wanting to heal. And I heard Dr. Ron Frost talk about the spirituality part of it, right? When people, they are affected in different ways. And talking with Dara, she brought up some issues that I hadn't even realized, and that's that there's people who have problems in their lives from the past, and it comes forward when they're starting to garden. And I thought it was amazing that we're talking about the psychological issues of people wanting to put their hands in the dirt to touch Mother Earth and how that affected them. It brought out some feelings of psychological things that you would not even realize this happened, during this time. And you talk about spirituality. There are, things with Mother Earth that the Native people understand. Eventually, we get people to grow their own food in the future. And there are changes that are going on in our earth. We find ways. We always find ways to survive. But we always have to keep in mind that water is very important, is the most important to keep us alive. There's a lot of things that are happening on the reservation with the gardens. And there's a lot of collaboration going on with the tribal offices. There were some suggestions of picking sites for growing chokecherry trees that, chokecherries are a major part of our traditional foods. Places where we can grow sweetgrass and sage, these things that are medicinally helpful to the people. But we find out that, there's always somebody out there looking for a profit and looking for ways to, to gain without thinking about the majority of the people. And they're selling our medicines back to us, which is not right. It doesn't sit right. We need to make sure that we protect the things that are growing on this earth. And I'm telling you this because this is really happening with our people right now. We need to make sure that we have our medicines in place because if you, I guess there's a book out there called Braiding Sweetgrass. And the author's name is Robin. And she talks about using medicines in our society. That medicines in our culture, they have spirits. And they would leave us if we're not using them right. And so I would also include that because Mother Earth produces the medicines that we need, that they are also spirits. That is a spiritual thing. And the cultural teachings that we learned from our ancestors, from our grandparents, our great-grandparents, that was handed down to us, the life lessons that we learned based on Mother Earth. And it's powerful. And you talk about, you know, what we can do to bring these things into harmony with, and I want to say with God's creation, because that's where I come from, is I'm talking about God's creation here. We need to be able to understand how important that is, not only on a scientific level, but also spiritually within ourselves. And that's what to this conversation. Our focus needs to go back to Mother Earth. We need to grow our foods. We need to be able to do that. But if we're going to be in a drought, or if we're going to be in some kind of danger because of the change in our climate, we need to be able to survive on this level, that we're able to say, let's take care of Mother Earth. Let's take care of ourselves also spiritually, because it's changing every day. How do the Earth? We should be doing more to grow for populations around us. You know, our reservation is a land-based reservation. We have a lot of land. And I think that we really should focus on that issue within our tribal members and say, what can we do to grow, to develop more for the rest of the population? And I believe that our younger generations, they need this knowledge too. When we get started, it's going to be an emotional journey for a lot of people because of the traumatic life experiences that they've had. But I believe that we can do something good out of this whole thing, where we can start with gardening and we help ourselves, and then we heal, and then we move on. And that's my message today. Thank you for letting me be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Roxanne. I hope everyone can stay on to continue the conversation. It is a gift to hear such passionate voices and informed voices. Thank you. I want to say one thing before I introduce again Dr. Steve Williams, but I deeply admire people who are resilient, who stay at the business of earthkeeping year after year after year. Steve is one of those. But Steve, I have to tell you, when I went to seminary, one of the major theologians defined God as the ground of our being. Please speak. You'll need to unmute. Steve. Yeah. No, he's muted. Steve? Oh.
There. Can you hear me? What it said was the host had muted me and you had to unmute me, but I'm unmuted now, whatever. I've got some written notes here and I may wander into them eventually, but I wanted to, listening to Ron and to Roxanne, I thought I would say a little bit more about my background, but because I think it's important here. First off, I want to acknowledge Robin Gross. Robin and I taught together for quite a long time. We team taught. And that adventure of being in front of students and thinking that you're teaching them and then realizing you're learning more from them than they are learning from you has become a theme throughout my life. I find myself this role reversal where, you know, those students, those people I considered my students are now my teachers, and I learn from them. But I grew up in New Mexico, and it's desert country. There's irrigated farmland. There are apple orchards. There's Atroplex, Connesson, saltbush deserts. There's mountains. It's a really diverse environment, and it's diverse culturally too. There are Native Americans there for certain, and I've worked with some of them. In fact, my brother's married to one. And there are certainly lots of Hispanics of various stripes. And that's created a really interesting and beautiful soup, if you will. It's not like it's not without some conflict in that culture, but still, it's a beautiful way to grow up. And during that time, though, I had the opportunity to work more and more with soil, sometimes digging ditches, sometimes working with the National Park Service in Yellowstone Park. I was involved with removal of a plant up there that was an alternate host for a detrimental fungus. And I spent a lot of time with my head in the hole looking at what was there. And that has engendered a fascination in this stuff that we walk on, we defecate on, we bury our dead in it, our food comes from it. To me, it's such a fascinating substance. You know, in the science of soil science, we try to reduce soil science down to a very conceptual equation. We call it the state equation, but it really says that soil is the product of the geological materials, which we like to call parent materials. Sorry about that, Ron. But the geological materials, the interaction of that with the climate and with the organisms that are there on a particular topography, a slope or an aspect, and all that is integrated across time to form particular soils. And the diversity of soils is fantastic. I am just always amazed at how much diversity there is, almost as much diversity as there are people on the planet. Oftentimes, I think the diversity in the soil or the characteristics of a soil in a certain place result in a particular culture developing there so that they can utilize that soil and in a way that's appropriate to their long-term survival. One of the great adventures of my life was working with the Native American tribe in western New Mexico that we call the Zuni. And I got involved more than by accident than by purpose, but still we had a fairly large project there for about 10 years, even some National Science Foundation funding, largely because of this unusual corn system that the Zunis had developed. They were able to grow corn with no inputs of exogenous fertilizer, or at least chemical fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, phosphorus or nitrogen or potassium for that matter, which we typically add to our crops. They were able to grow corn on the same land without these fertilizers. Certainly they irrigated this corn, but mostly from rainfall. It would fall in the hills around the cornfields, and occasionally there would be enough rainfall that they would get some overland flow down the arroyos, the gullies, and they would divert this onto their fields. And they had fields that were an acre in size, fields that were 300 acres in size. And the Zuni always had corn. If it was a dry year, they had less corn. If it was a wet year, they had lots of corn. But a lot of it had to do with the size of these fields. And that is, if they could only irrigate a few acres, they had fields that were only a few acres. But if they had 16 inches of rain that summer, they could irrigate the 300-acre fields too. But it was such a unique experience for me to see this corn growing system. And during the time of the Spanish conquest of that era, Coronado and others came through. In fact, the Zuni Pueblo was considered one of the 7 cities of Cibola, the golden cities, and it turned out they were just adobe towns that looked somewhat golden. But shortly thereafter, there were priests that came. There was religion, the Christian religion that came. And it's so remarkable to me how the spirituality of the Kachinas and the Zunis were able to coalesce with the Christian religion. There's a mission there at Black Rock on the Zuni reservation. And if you walk from the back of this mission towards the front, first off, you are passing Kachinas that are painted on the walls. As you move further and further forward, you start seeing a few saints among the Kachinas. By the time you get to the front where the altar is, there's the Christ. And every part of their society is dictated by what happens with the Kachinas and what happens with the church. It's really a remarkable culture. And the corn that they grow is so remarkable too. And the Spanish, they let it be known that the Zuni corn and the Zuni way of farming was very, very primitive and should be stamped out. And when the US took over, the United States took over New Mexico and Arizona and that area, the people that came in, they thought the same way, that the Zuni needed to start using fertilizers, using inbred corn, and the Zuni resisted that, at least many of them did. The fact of the matter is they've been getting corn production off of these fields on the Zuni reservation for 25 centuries. It's as close to a perfectly sustainable agricultural system as I can imagine. And yeah, there's a great deal of beauty there. The other really big event in my life was winning a contest, and that's another story, where I wound up going to Inner Mongolia, a province of China, and working with, it's an autonomous province, but working with Mongolians and Chinese there. And then eventually finding myself in the Republic of Mongolia, just to the north, which now is a democracy, but it's been an independent country since 1948, and working with Mongolians. And the amazing agriculture that they have there, and the respect they have for the soil, the respect they have for climate. It's a very difficult climate. It's probably even more difficult than the climate we have in Wyoming in terms of drought and sandstorms and cattle that die and absence of plants in their nutrition and how they accommodate that, etc. And I lived with a Mongolian family up on the edge of the Gobi for a while. And this was a family that had never even heard of Christianity. And yet they were extremely spiritual, as I would define it. They had great respect for the land. They were good to their children. Children were very important in that culture. And so I would say that in my experience, spirituality cuts a lot of different directions. And it's an important aspect that's hard to define. I think we know what it's like when we feel it. But I find myself, I'm a soil microbiologist. I work with the microorganisms in the soil. And we talk about this amazing universe in which we live. We can look at the stars, we get a telescope and see the moons circling around Jupiter. We can look deeply into the universe. And I had a professor at New Mexico State University. His name was Clyde Tombaugh. Clyde Tombaugh is known across the planet as the co-discoverer of the planet Pluto. And he and some of his compatriots had done some calculations based on just some very simple mathematics as to how many other planets the size of Earth there would be in our galaxy that are approximately 93 million miles from a sun about the size of our sun. The conservative estimate is 100,000. And he was very interested in life, where life might exist, where it might not exist. And even though he was clearly an astronomer and very much a scientist, he imparted a sense of spirituality and the amazement that he had for this universe in which we sit in somehow. My universe is under the microscope, and the things that I see under the microscope blow me away. Organisms that are a trillionth my size, that are reproducing and living and providing all of these services, if you will, to those of us that live above ground. So that's part of my world. I could blather on for the next hour, but I know that we're going to want to do other than just listen to me. But I had made some notes. Ron has already brought up this issue of climate change. I worked in New Zealand for a while, quite a while actually, and they've stopped calling it climate change down there. New Zealand, small island country, storms affect them tremendously. Changes in precipitation patterns affect them tremendously. They don't call it climate change any longer. They call it climate disruption, because everything that's happening there is disrupting what's happening on those islands. And so there's climate change, and that's a huge threat. As we were talking earlier, as we were setting this up, a couple of days ago, we were talking about the causative agents of climate change. And Ron has already brought this up to some degree. It's humans. And you could say it's our science. It's more than that. It's our desire to live on this planet, to live comfortably, and to secure lots of materialistic items. That's a good deal of our problem. and we are also the solution too. And that is, we have these gray matters up here that we think can help in the solution. That's obviously to be seen. There's this huge experiment going on. And the experiment is really, can we come together as a species and all the variants of our species? Can we come together to address this huge problem that we call climate disruption? And there's so many pieces of that affect us in terms of methane release from the Arctic, sea level rise that are going to affect a lot of our cities, and many, many other things, drought, changing temperature regimes, etc. And my sense is, knowing some of the science, not all of it, of course, is that we have the technology to solve this, the climate crisis, if you will. But we do need to solve it relatively quickly. The projections are that if we don't do something to reduce greenhouse gases in the environment, at least slow it down, that by 2030, some people say, some people as much as 2050, that the process will be irreversible. But my sense is, my strong sense, and I hear other people at conferences talking about this too, is that yes, we do have the technology to resolve this, but we do not have the ethical and the decision-making process, if you will, to do this. That there are big inhibitions that stand in our way. One of them is this expanding population, the 7.3 billion people, that continues to increase and demand more and more resources. And we could say, well, we're controlling that somewhat in this country. Well, maybe it is, but we're certainly using more and more energy in this country all the time. Energy acquisition is certainly a big contributor to climate change. And we're trying to do some things, but it needs to be a comprehensive effort, not just the 4% of the population that make up the US, but the 100% that make up the world. When I was in New Zealand, the first time I had 18 students with me that we'd selected and brought there to study invasive species. It was a fascinating experiment to be there, but there was one of the students who is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He was from their capital city. And he said he really understood very clearly what we were talking about in terms of invasive species and how problematic those were, especially those that were really problematic, that were really noxious, if you will, in the landscape. But he said, in his capital of Kinshasa in the Congo, he said 99.5% of the people there are concerned about their next meal, where their next meal is going to come from. They are not concerned about invasive species. They are not concerned about atmospheric CO2 increases. And that's how most of the world operates, is at that level. We can talk about the United Kingdom or the EU or Australia or New Zealand or the US or Canada, but we are the vast minority of people on this planet, and so many are looking for that next meal. I have just a couple of other things that I want to touch on briefly, and a lot of this has to do with the decision-making process. You know, if we can get together and start making decisions, that's great. But I've had the opportunity to work with a colleague out of New Zealand on the decision-making process, and those characteristics that our natural resource managers need for making decisions. And I would contend this is something that all of our population needs to learn about making decisions. And one of the skills, the most important skill to develop, is trust. And that is trust in the people that are making the decision, trust in the information that's being used to make the decision, and trust in the whole process. There are so many examples of good intentions of natural resource mitigation that have gone awry because the decision makers forgot to bring in the various people involved that were going to be affected by that decision into a trust situation where they trusted the situation. One of the best examples was right here in Wyoming. That is Medicine Wheel up there in the northern Bighorn Mountains. That's on Forest Service land. And the Forest Service wanted to develop this sacred site, this site that was sacred to 16 different tribes in the Northern Rockies and the Great Plains. The Forest Service wanted to develop this site, put up a tower, a campground, all that sort of thing, parking lot, so people could come in and see it. I've been there a couple of times, and it is fantastic. The tribes did not want to do that. They wanted, sure, it could be open to the public, but you had to walk in. And no campgrounds, no towers, so you could look down on it. This is a site that's at almost 10,000 feet elevation. It's very pristine, it's very beautiful, and it certainly has a great deal of spirituality for anybody that goes and sees this site. Well, the Forest Service didn't like what the Native Americans were proposing. And they said, gosh, if you don't change your tune, we own the land, we're going to bulldoze it off into a side canyon. The Native Americans got up and left. And it was only about 20 years later that finally they got back to the table and back to a solution that was satisfactory to everybody. It was this issue of trust. Trust is so hard to build, and you can lose it in a nanosecond. And I think it's a key in terms of building trust is to present how you're going to make this decision. And one of those decision key pieces is to use best information. Of course, what's best information? I think of it as credentialed information. But what is credentialed information? Stuff I see in the journals, I think of as being credentialed information. But also people that have been walking the land, looking at that land for 25 centuries, like the Zuni, they have credentials that nobody else has. And I think we need to take into consideration those people that have been walking the land for 25 centuries, those people that have been on a piece of land for 2 or 3 generations, deriving, hopefully, gently, a living from that land. I could go on and on, but this is my piece. A little bit on soil science, a little bit on climate change, a little bit on decision making. And I guess the main thesis, though, is trust and trust building. So I would thank you, Sally, for pushing me to get involved in this. And I appreciate Ron's words and Roxanne's words. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.